So hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining this open presentation and discussion. Today's session, or this session, is being brought to you by Mr. Mark Annati, the SVP of IT at Extreme Reach. And Mark is going to be leading a case study presentation on what he learned implementing robotic process automation from scratch at Extreme Reach. So as with some of the sessions yesterday, guys, Mark is going to lead with a presentation, and then we will leave ample time at the end of that for some questions from you folks on any of those areas that are burning in your head when it comes to RPA, which is obviously a bit of a hot topic right now, but still a lot of uncertainty around it. So Mark, if you can turn your camera on for us now and join us for the session. Hello there, sir. So everyone, this is Mark. I'm going to hand over to him. Mark is going to take you through his presentation, his case study, and then, as I said, we'll leave some time at the end for some Q&A. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'm just going to share my screen and get the presentation going. Good day, everybody. Can you hear and see the presentation right now?
Not yet, Mark. You just need to share your screen.
Oh, yes, there we go. Thank you.
And there you go.
And that's why we check those things, to make sure we're on track. So good day, everybody. Today, I'm going to share with you our journey to date, and it started in the beginning, or rather the end of 2019, when RPA was introduced to Extreme Reach. And I'm going to show you how basically it is a journey along the way. And in essence, I'm going to cover these areas of why we adopted it. We're going to talk about why you should adopt it, or if you should adopt it. What it takes to develop and partner and get it bootstrapped, and the infrastructure and operation support needed, and sort of where we ended up and where we're going next. So that's what I'm going to cover today. And first, I'd like to lead off with, why did Extreme Reach adopt RPA? Well, interestingly, it was introduced to our executive team towards the end of 2019. One of our investment groups had introduced one of the primary technologies to Extreme Reach, and then it filtered down to me, and then I took charge of that, and we brought in an RPA company and did a proof of concept, which took a couple of days. It was pretty quick, and it was on our invoicing process, and I'm going to be talking about our invoicing process quite a bit, because that's our first project that we completed. And then we dove a bit deeper into it, compared vendors, and wound up deciding on a technology. But as part of this journey, we had to evaluate internally what were the processes that we needed to automate. So there's a lot of processes, and I have no doubt your companies aren't too much different from ours, that you have disconnected parts and a lot of human effort. And you need to evaluate those at least periodically and say, can we do better? Can we be more efficient? That kind of a thing. And many times you need development work, but you don't have the developers to do it. So you need a glue to put those parts together to further automate. And that's where RPA comes in. So making sure those disconnected parts and human efforts, that you can work that further. For us as well, it was competition for internal resources. We have a development team. They have many different project priorities. We have a lot of different products that we support. AdBridge is our primary platform. Extreme Reach is in the media advertising space. We're a business-to-business provider, and we have many different products that we support and a lot of different development efforts. So competing for those internal resources is very difficult, especially when it comes to internal operations. And I know some of you are saying, yep, I totally get where you're coming from, right? So having a middleware solution that doesn't tax our development resources is very attractive to us and to many organizations, right? Think of, when you learned about Excel macros, ooh, that was so exciting. You could automate these things in Excel, put that on steroids and expand it across multiple products, and there you have RPA. So it helps you maintain a competitive edge as well, because you're now automating things that your competitors have already automated, right? And overall, you need to reduce the pain in your organization because you have pain points, things that take a lot of time and energy. And by golly, it works. There's no doubt that RPA solutions are successful. There's many different references on the web that you can find. So I knew this was a successful option for us to go. And that really sort of raises the questions of why would you want to implement RPA, right? Does your company need RPA? And the first thing I'll say is don't use RPA. Why? Because you want to expand on the existing applications and solve the problems as close to the problem as possible. RPA, it's middleware, and middleware has its own challenges of implementation, management, maintaining, all of those things. So the first thing is just, can you solve the problem elsewhere without middleware? And if you can't, then RPA is potentially a very good option for you. You have to identify your pain points, and that involves surveying your leadership, your sales organization, your operations, your product owners. What we did is we had a calculator provided to us, a spreadsheet that had different elements on the particular process that you wanted to consider, and then the human hours required to maintain that process. Were there different other components involved? And basically a number of things that allowed you to weigh out the process against other processes in your organization that were qualifiers. So you can get a calculator, and the different providers have this, including your development shop that you're going to work with, if you're going to work with a development shop for the evaluation process and the solution. So the marketplace and the competition may just require you to automate. I know when I was interviewing RPA clients, people who had actually implemented RPA, which I highly recommend you do, because several of them were manufacturing and other types of shops where the margins are so slim that any increase in production and efficiency is highly measurable and puts you above in the marketplace. So that was really important, is to identify those operational efficiencies, those cost-saving areas, whether you need to improve quality and accuracy to get that competitive advantage. And you'll hear this time and time again from the RPA experts, is do the simple processes first. One of the mistakes we made is we picked two different processes to tackle right out of the gate. One of them was invoice processing, and that may sound simple, but ours was quite a bit challenging, and I'll explain a bit more about that. And then the other was these media reports that we get in of all sorts of different formats that we need to turn into actionable data that we can bring into our system that are manually done. And we took on the latter one to begin with, but it was the much more complex of the two. And after a number of weeks, we decided to switch gears and go over to the invoice processing because it was much more straightforward. We didn't have all the answers on the other project, so we needed to line that up. And so we switched gears. And luckily, we had the flexibility to do that, to switch gears. We weren't as deep into it. But overall, if your company is a good candidate for RPA, and I think most companies are, you just need to have that executive buy-in. They need to support it. You need to have the calculators and the forethought to figure out what are the processes that would be good candidates for RPA, robotics process automation. By the way, finance, HR, those are very popular ones, and we tackled finance out of the gate. But anywhere where you've got a repetitive process flow and something that doesn't have too many variables in it, at least if you can't build to address the variables along the way, you should make sure that it's a pretty rote process that you have down. So we had to pick a technology, right, to go with, because there's many different RPA competitor technologies. Here's just a few in alphabetical order. I'm purposely not going to dive into the different technologies out there. By the way, they all work. So it's really a matter of what's the best that meets your needs. And that's going to require a lot more evaluation than I can give you in this presentation. I'll share with you that we compared a couple of the top competitors. Frankly, either of them could have provided the solution. We went with the one at the time that was much more self-contained from my view. And I'm being very careful with my words because this technology is evolving significantly. It's like seeing the first quarter mile of a horse race. You just don't know who's going to pull ahead in advance. And that's what's happening here is these different technologies are advancing in different ways. Some of them have better community and training than others. Some of them are more targeted to certain business verticals. So you have to evaluate that. And what I'd recommend is you just, when you're starting to evaluate the process, look at things like Gartner and other references, but then get on the phone and start talking with people. And I'll tell you that was something that our CFO definitely insisted on, was like, talk with these RPA implementers and find out more about their experience. And that was probably one of the most fruitful exercises that I did, was interviewing various RPA implementers and finding out how did they come across the technology, what did they choose for their first processes. I basically had a whole series of questions that I asked them along the way. Another thing about RPA technologies and choosing the right options is what's going to be your human investment. My investment was going to be minimal. I wear multiple hats at Extreme Reach. Security is a lot of what I do these days. And RPA, though exciting as it is I was realistic in saying, I'm not going to be able to devote full days to RPA. It's going to be a part-time gig for me. So gauge the number of hats that you wear and how involved your level of participation will be. Are you going to be the project manager? Are you going to lead the effort? Are you actually going to do the development or some of the development work, right? So be aware of that, because that's going to affect how much you're going to need to outsource and bootstrap the process. All of these technologies you can bring in and do yourself. They have the materials, the training materials, the references and things like that. But, if you're going to build a house, it's easier to get a foundation guy to come in and do the foundation and put the house on that than to build the foundation yourself. And basically everything can be outsourced, right? But it costs you money to outsource. So the DIY versus the, get me bootstrapped as quickly as possible, you're going to have to weigh that, and it depends on you as the leader or the manager of the effort. And what are the actual costs, right? Sometimes it's a bit hard. Like at one point I was between these two vendors that we were working with, or solution providers rather. I was trying to compare apples to apples, and it can be very difficult, especially with the licensing model that the particular RPA solution provides. What's going to cost you, what's not, what's in the cloud, what's on-prem, what are going to be your costs for not only maintaining infrastructure, but the operational support required. So consider, licensing, the project management resources you're going to need internally, the development and IT resources, where are you going to host it, any of the monitoring and durability that's needed with it. What is your SLA with the solution? What's the uptime of that? So I'm just going to share, be careful underestimating your particular investment. And that's not only monetary, but it's human time and the number of human resources required to get this going. But don't panic, because you can work this step by step. That's what we did. So what does it take to develop RPA? Well, it takes sponsorship. You must have executive and stakeholder support, and you're going to have a number of contributors along the way. And I recommend that you have a process caretaker. And that really leads to, it takes a village. It takes a number of people to do this. At minimum, I think you need a project management lead. You're going to need a business analyst, or the stakeholders from the business side of the house who are very, very knowledgeable on the process to be automated. You're going to require a development lead, whether that be outsourced or internal, and an IT person for the infrastructure and security and other aspects that involve IT. And you're going to need time to participate. Hey, see that last slide that I talked about your time, right? How much of your time is it going to take? And you're going to need passion and motivation for the cause. You're going to need people who really want to get the project done. I think that's the case with any project. You need passion and motivation, but definitely here, especially if it's a new technology in your environment. Many of you in the technology space know of projects that have come about and failed just because the enthusiasm died, or the direction changed, the wind changed, and all of a sudden it just wasn't as exciting or deemed to be as profitable as before. So you need a village to make this happen. And know your internal limitations. That's not only with what I described earlier as far as your participation time, but how are you going to get these resources to be involved? I know with our new project that we've got going on, I've got resources involved who are just stretched to the limit. So I have to be very, very careful on pulling them in to consult and work on the project with me. So you have competing priorities. You may have lack of smooth administration in your environment. That's a big one, because there's a lot of documentation and process involved with implementing RPA. It's not just, I got a bot in here and the bot's going to do things and I'm good to go. It's like any other infrastructure related project or technology that you're implementing. It comes with baggage. And that baggage are all of the things that are needed to make it work smoothly. So if you're good with administration in your current company, that's a big plus. It's awesome. So a part of implementing RPA technology is making sure that you have a well understood process and solid documentation. And I'm going to focus on that a bit more. I'll share with you that if you think that you can go without this, then you've already failed, and you want to fail quickly and recover quickly, right? Fail fast and recover quickly. The approach that you should take is more of a long-term design approach. And that means that if you can get your failures to fail on paper before you do the development, that's great. Ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure any day, right? So should your partner be knowledgeable and experienced? Well, duh, yes, of course, right? You want to pick a good partner to work with. A good development shop will bootstrap your RPA implementation for sure. So, and there's a lot of different RPA consulting companies. We went with a company called RPA Now. They've been great and been super helpful to get us bootstrapped and working. And we have, as I said, this one project done, and now we're entering into our second project. So with your vendors, vet them. Make sure that you check their references, talk to clients that they've had, understand based on your level of participation and involvement, again, how much are you going to do yourself versus outsource? If you're going to outsource the whole kit and caboodle and just say, look, build this thing for me, put it in place, and then I want you to maintain it as well. That's quite a bit different than saying, look, I want you to build it, but I want you to teach me along the way, and we're going to host everything, and we're going to manage it as well. So that's a different level of involvement, and that's what you should be asking the clients of those vendors as you interview them, to identify what amount of efforts did this particular vendor, and I'm saying vendor here to be pretty agnostic with the consulting company that you choose. Not all shops are equal in experience, so understanding how many RPA projects they've actually completed successfully is key. And just be aware of offshore development rates, because they can be very attractive, but ultimately, and I put a big but there, ultimately there's communication, there's timing, like when you can meet. We've been working with an offshore based in India, and also people in Texas, right? But our primary developer has been offshore in India. So meeting time is very challenging. We're meeting early morning our time, but evening their time. So you have to just take that into account as to that whole process of when you're talking, what's going to be done, how time and other factors will either help or detract from the project itself. Clearly define your statement of work with this vendor. It's very, very important that you have very clear objectives, even if it's just an initial proof of concept that you're going to implement, and just get your feet wet and prove it out to the executive team, which is what we did. We actually had a proof of concept done with an invoice processing, but it was in development. It wasn't full production. It was sort of a 2-day effort to just say, hey, it works. But I'll tell you, it works. There's no question about that. It's just making sure you implement it correctly. So with your SOW, just give yourself some room to adjust and regroup to make sure that you can change a few things along the way. Your objectives are clear, but give yourself some wiggle room there, and weigh the previous points on your participation level. I keep coming back to this because of all of the hats that different people wear, and when you bring something new into your environment, you're not necessarily going to hire for it right away, right? So you have to develop internally. And that means that you have to have communication. Communication is key. With anything we do at Extreme Reach, communication is top of the list. Communication, culture, making sure that we're being transparent, that we're all on the same wavelength. Many of you have probably experienced projects where there's lack of communication that causes confusion, it causes project delays and failures. We don't want that. It's all about communication. Make sure that you establish communication and administrative standards early on. This is one thing that we did when we brought RPA in. It was like, okay, here's how we're going to communicate. We're going to use collaborative documentation where we use Google Docs, and that makes it real easy to maintain agenda notes and schedules and do all sorts of things. And the vendor that you choose, whether it be the RPA development company, and most probably the technology that you provide, in our case it was UiPath, they have a whole framework for implementing RPA, and you should leverage that. As a matter of fact, if you don't use that framework, then you're not following the best practices that they've established, and continue to refine along the way. So there is not only your internal best of breed framework, how you work projects internally, but it's the vendor's prescription as well, and making sure there's a good blend of those two and using the tools. So I recommend that you communicate often and transparently. Many times we would have process flow discussions. We had development cadence meetings daily. We would meet daily to work on what's the progress that's been made with the development, what are the challenges that we've hit, what's working, what's not working, do we need to do any redesign, that kind of a thing along the way. We heavily utilized IM, instant messaging, email groups, all of that I set up in advance, right when we began, so that there was no question, right? Because you can fumble the ball pretty quick when you just don't communicate properly or timely. And one of the things that we do is I record critical discussions and meetings for sharing and review. For example, I have a periodic update meeting on where we are with RPA, and I know people are busy, and maybe it only takes me 10 minutes to give the update. I'll record that, and then I'll distribute that to the stakeholders who could not make it to that meeting. We've had code reviews sessions where I've recorded that, and that's a great learning tool for other developers or people just to understand what the process flow, how it works, and how the coding is has been implemented to address that process flow. And then, of course, weekly or bi-weekly updates to stakeholders, just making sure, that executive who supports the project may not know anything about it until you hit them up every 2 weeks with a status update, right? But communication is absolutely key here. And that leads you to, you gotta map the process. That is just the absolute requirement. You must map the process. Of course, is it the right process to start with? You need to make that decision and then map that process. And in mapping the process, you have to do a diagram of a current and to be. Like I'm saying have to do. If you don't do that, you can't really develop an RPA. You have to have a plan. Just like a builder is going to have a plan, you need to have a plan to make this happen. So it's going to be a current process and a to be flow. And the natural tendency is to go with the to be flow. It's going to be like, hey, I already know the process. Hey, no sweat. Let me just map out what I think it should be. And I'm telling you, that's a wrong move. And that's a move, that was a mistake that we made. We didn't spend enough energy on the current flow and documenting that. And I say that because we missed a few things in mapping the current flow. So I mentioned earlier that our first project was this invoice processing project. And basically we have, I don't know, 20,000 invoices a year, somewhere in that range. And those invoices come in from all sorts of different vendors, right? And then some of those invoices need to be approved by other team members. So there's this email exchange that goes back and forth with AP. And then once that's approved, there has to be an extraction of the data from the invoice. And then it needs to be weighed against a reference on what business units it's booked against, what's the COGS categories, those kinds of elements. And then it's put into, we utilize NetSuite. It goes into NetSuite and it's booked accordingly, right? So we had to figure out all of these flows and figure out which of those, once you do the current flow, you'll clearly identify the pain points. And that will help you design the to-be flow as well. And I recommend that you just ask questions. You view it from different perspectives. If you're the project manager of this, you may not be intimate with the flow. You may not be working it, but you need to get that stakeholder involved and ask them the probing questions, because maybe they do something. Maybe they check something that they don't think it's important. It's an important step at all. It's not even worth mentioning in the process flow, but you need to put that in there. So in you probing and getting the different perspectives, it will be very helpful for you. So don't ignore the details, bring them about, and be careful. Don't build for edge cases. Those are going to come up. People are going to say, what about this? And what about that? And you need to question those and identify, how often does that happen? Can we continue to support that with a human effort, right? So I recommend that you don't build for the edge cases, but you make sure you consider them and know how to handle them. Maybe you put an invoice in a queue because it's unrecognizable, it's never been processed before, whatever, right? So you just need to be aware of those, but RPA is not really for the edge cases. Maybe it's a down the road feature enhancement. And the to-be flow, what you're designing to, very, very important. It's the tools and the controls required for configuration and variables. And I'll say that one of the things that we dealt with was, and was always in my mind, was I have an RPA developer creating a solution, and it's with a bot, and the bots you get are either, or the bots you implement are either attended or unattended. And attended means that periodically it's going to stop and a human's going to interact with it, right? And unattended means you let it go and it goes and it does its thing. We decided to opt for the unattended bots, right? And we did this before we even knew exactly what kind of bot we needed. We thought we knew, but you know, you really don't know until you get into this stuff. We made the right choice with an unattended bot, but it also meant that we needed to program it in ways where it was parking work in areas until a human had to do something, if a human was required. So for example, one of the things that we needed to do was make sure we had approval to pay the invoice. And we didn't do anything with the invoice until we had that approval. So part of our automation was for the bot to reach into the email, grab the invoice, I balance it against a spreadsheet that had the approvers listed, grab the approver email, forward the email to the approver and say, hey, if you, after you review this, if you've approved it, just reply to me with approved and it'll take it from there. And that's what would happen. So then the team member would approve it, it would go back, in the mailbox queue. The bot would see it there, update a spreadsheet, and now it's on its way. And when I'm referring to these spreadsheets, these are spreadsheets that we used for allocations. For if an invoice came in, we use a very big circuits provider, and we get multiple invoices from them. They all look the same except for an account number. So the bot's going in and doing OCR recognition, and it's identifying the account numbers. And we've built a spreadsheet that just said, hey, if you get a whole bunch of numbers and you don't know which one of these is the account number, here's the account numbers that we noted for this particular vendor, and grab, if one of these matches, then that's for this vendor and that's this account number, and then you can do the rest of the processing along the way. And I hope in giving you these little details about our invoice processing, I'm expressing some of the challenges that we had along the way. So making sure that you can kick off the right process and you could park in certain sections with an unattended bot, it would continue through, park a few things, and continue and bring other things to the end of the road where we would book it into our enterprise resource processing system. And that is critical for an unattended bot. So there were process flows that were created in the bot that would do something, and it would just leave something in a status where, okay, I'm going to check back on this later and execute additional process flows. I spent a little time on that because we internally spent a lot of energy on it, including having an allocation spreadsheet where we actually indicate, here's the particular invoice, here's the business units and the COGS categories that it needs to be allocated to, and we could just change that in the spreadsheet. We don't have to change that in code, and it's nothing new to accounts payable, right? They do that kind of stuff all the time. The next thing was just making sure data integrity and verification checks were done, right? So you're going to have to gain confidence that the bot is doing exactly what it can do. And we decided that we want to make sure that the data integrity and verification is done right up front. So we're actually doing an OCR, a scraping of the data, and putting it into a spreadsheet. And that particular step requires human review, to just take a quick look at the invoice and the data that was scraped and make sure that that looks good. And if it looks good, then we can approve it and move it forward in the process. And then we can just do a periodic spot check at the end result and make sure that it booked properly. And that has been very helpful for us. What you don't want is you don't want dirty data in, you find it out in the end, and then you got to fix things. So I recommend, right up front, you're just making sure that the data integrity and verification steps are done. And then you have to have troubleshooting paths described in the to-be flow. And this means that you've got certain logging, you're able to capture things. So one of the things our bot does is it logs into NetSuite and it books the invoice, and it may be multiple entries that it needs to book, right? And so we designed it so that, and that's a human thing, right? So we're not doing an API interface, and that would be the better way to go, admittedly, is to use an API interface for any of this stuff. But in this case, we were building to in the middleware realm, right? The glue. And so we were emulating what the AP person would do, logging into NetSuite and going that flow. But where I'm going here is that if there was an error, the bot would take a screenshot. So in the browser session, which would instantiate every time for every invoice, doing a login, making sure that everything's fresh, right? And then booking the information. If it came up with an error, it would take a screenshot. And that helped us on a few occasions to identify what the issue was. Maybe there was some nag screen or a new change in the UI, right? So things like that will help. And don't develop until you've nailed this, the current and the to-be flow. Super important that you do that. By the way, we should be doing that anyways for anything in our business, right? Any process flow, you should have it mapped out. It shouldn't be up here. It shouldn't be tribal knowledge. It should be documented and in an understood process flow. But don't do RPA until you've nailed this step of mapping the process properly. So that sort of brings us to, what's important to note regarding your infrastructure setup, right? What are those things that you need to keep in mind? Well, the provider solution that you have may have a mixture of on-prem and cloud-hosted options. In our case with UiPath, it has an orchestrator in the cloud, and the orchestrator is the one that schedules the bot, manages the bot, has logs related to the bot. It holds credentials related to what the bot needs to access where. By the way, you could put credentials in different places, but this was the most secure and centrally accessible place for us to implement it. It may be different in your case, but the orchestrator does that. The orchestrator can host configuration data as well, so that if you need to change, we have certain configuration data that is hosted in the orchestrator. I did mention some spreadsheets that we use with the invoice process. Those are very human, accessible, readable, updatable, right? The configuration that lives in orchestrator, not that accessible or maintainable by the end user. So we made some decisions. There are some settings that are in the configuration settings in orchestrator, but the majority of stuff is in 3 different spreadsheets that we use for this particular processing automation. And I'm going to just emphasize, and you've heard it numerous times here, to document. And I say that because a lot of people just stay away from documentation. It's a painful thing. Maybe they're not good at it. So I'm going to say find someone who's good at it or can help you with the documentation, but you must document along the way. I think that's the case with all IT projects, but in this case, documentation is key. Security. You always want to make sure that you're maintaining data protection and privacy, that you're protecting your access keys, that you've got plenty of logging, and then periodic controls and auditing to just make sure that you're keeping within your security framework, making sure that you're meeting the requirements of your customers. I'm not sure about you, but these days we receive in our MSAs or the MSA agreements that we have with our clients, security provisions that we must maintain and meet. And there are so many regulations that are out there, governing bodies that require certain things, CCPA being one of them, right? That you need to just make sure you've crossed the T's, dotted the I's in the security realm. And then there's durability, right? How resilient does this need to be? Do you need to have multiple infrastructure set up? In our case, so we have this cloud portion, which is called the orchestrator, and then on-prem, we have dedicated virtual machines for the development environment and the production environment. So you need to have those separations. Some of you may have a staging or a quality control environment. You need to have a place to deposit your code. So you have to have a code repository. And in our case, we're using our code repository for the vendor to save the bot code. And it's just like any other development effort. You're going to have check-ins. You're going to have releases that you're going to need to do to production, right? You're going to have SOPs related to those releases. You're going to have impact, right? So durability is one of those things that you're going to need to know what's the SLA, not only the SLA internally with the bot, but the SLA with the provider. In our case with UiPath, with Orchestrator, it's built on redundant and scalable technology. So the concern of it being unavailable is very, very low. And that's the thing, is if you're building this and hosting a lot of this in-house, maybe you have your own orchestrator in-house. And by the way, I believe we were the first customer to use the cloud orchestrator with UiPath. At least that's what my consulting vendor has told us. But anyways, long story short is you need to make sure that you're meeting the durability requirements of the technology and build it to self-heal. Make sure that if the bot, hangs for whatever reason, that maybe there's a job recycle that brings it back, until you have time to troubleshoot it further. But make things self-healing in your design process. And keep in mind the various service limits, the updates, the notifications that are needed. In one case, we're using an OCR plugin by UiPath, and it's a community version of it, so we're not paying extra for it. And that's another aspect of licensing that you have to keep in mind, is what are the plugins that are needed for the RPA technology to work, because it has to communicate with all of these other technologies. And so with that, we use an OCR technology, and that was limited to 1 document per minute. And we discovered that a little down the road. Now, luckily, we didn't require a high-speed multi-documents a minute. So we were able to put a little timer in place and make sure that we were only submitting 1 document per minute. But be aware of those service limits. Stay plugged into the capabilities and the changes and the service modifications. And that's another time requirement of you. You need to be on top of these. There's all sorts of notifications that I get from UiPath. I got to tell you, I can't keep up with them. There's just so many. So you're going to rely on your vendor, your consulting vendor, to help you with those and identify what's important and what's not. We're rounding the corner here, and I can tell that we're going to have very little time for the questions, but I hope I'm answering a bunch of your questions on the way. And one of the questions you may have is, what about ongoing operations and support? Well, that's a concern, and it's a time demand, and depending on the care and feeding of your bot, it could be substantial, or it could be, you know, it all depends on the bot and process design. And one thing we've done is we've had periodic meetings. So now that we've baked our AP invoice process with an RPA solution, now we were meeting once a week to check in. Now we're meeting every 3 weeks to check in, see how things are going. What are the challenges? What are the solutions? You know, do we have any additions, things that we need to make sure that we're maintaining along the way? So as you have these cadence meetings and these development meetings, you need to make sure that your design documentation is maintained along the way as well. And that brings us to having a caretaker, someone who's dedicated to RPA, who's the operator or the manager. And do you need a dedicated person? Well, it depends on the care and feeding required of the bot. How many bots do you have in place, right? We only have 1, so we don't need a dedicated position for that, right? And for now, it's a side gig until we expand further. I've heard the rule of thumb of 10 processes to 1 dedicated resource, but I don't have enough experience to tell you if that's the fact. And in interviewing a number of RPA implementers, I found that it varied. Some shops had entire internal teams dedicated to RPA. Others outsourced almost all of it, and there was a mixed bag in between. So you're going to find the right size that fits for your company and your resources. And that brings us to the last slide here, which is, where did we wind up in the end? Well, I've described a bit of it along the way. It's really a journey, right? We have a solid start. We've successfully implemented this AP invoice project, learned a lot along the way, set up all sorts of infrastructure and support, gained confidence by the executive team. We've established the methodology. We have a trusted development partner, RPA now, who's helping us. And now it's really a matter of, how do we continually improve what we've already implemented? And I'm all about continual improvements, every little bit, every little thing you can do to improve. And we're moving on to our next RPA project. Our next one involves talent media reports. One of the things that we do, we're one of the largest payers of talent performers and contributors in the United States, because talent needs to hang their payroll hat somewhere. And that's one of the things we do. And we pay them based on the commercials that have aired. So we get reports on those from all sorts of different media companies. And those reports are very disparate. There's not one standard, there's many standards. And we have some of those automated going into our system, but we have a lot of those reports that are manually treated by humans. And it takes a lot of time, it's very tedious, you have to be extremely accurate, and it's just one of those areas you just got to automate. So that's what we're automating next. As part of that, we're building a new machine learning service to take these various reports in and work them and add on our existing platform, our ad bridge. That's our primary platform that we use. So we're going to use that service, and then we're going to use RPA to interact with that service to submit reports, pull the data out. And then, of course, we're going to line up the next candidates for automation. What other things in finance and HR and accounts management can we automate? And we're just scratching the surface. It is truly just a journey. I know I didn't leave much time for questions, but I really appreciate you hanging with me during this time. Back to you, Jason. Did I miss anybody? I'm not hearing anybody. And does that mean I'm still on? Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, I was like getting really nervous there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Very thorough, but amazing to see the journey you've actually taken. So really appreciate the insight there. And we do have a few questions. We've only got a few minutes, but I do want to get through some of these questions as the audience have taken the time.
Sure.
First, Mike Arkeson, what process mapping tool did you use? How many positions were you able to eliminate? What was the net annual savings from deploying RPA, and how did you compute this? So a few questions rolled into one.
Oh, yeah. So first off, we have one AP clerk that is working the process now, and when we've been meeting, I've been doing my best to map out how much time has been saved. So I don't have a number to provide you other than the time has been saved, but I need to go through a number of weeks to further evaluate that. Plus the initial investment in RPA, the licensing, the time required, the implementation and setup, we have not recovered the costs, the initial investment costs. So I would say you have to keep in mind that that initial investment, that bootstrap startup, is to get all of that framework in place. You aren't necessarily going to save that money right away. It depends on the process that you choose. Did I touch upon most of what was being asked there? I may have missed something.
Definitely. The next question coming in here is from Christopher Davis, which is a bit of a follow-up to a certain extent, because this is asking, did you build a business case for RPA, or did you just start and learn? And ultimately, what was your ROI and how quick is it realized? So a bit of a continuation there.
Yeah, so the business case was really about what are the opportunities for RPA in our environment. There wasn't a question that it would be beneficial. So that wasn't the question. It was a matter of how much were we willing to invest and what were the pain points that were most important for us to resolve that we couldn't resolve with other tools and existing development staff. And so really the big thrust here was to not impact our development team and provide a middleware solution that could solve some of these process flow problems.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. That brings us to the end of our session. So virtual round of applause goes for Mark here as well. Thank you very much, sir. Greatly appreciated.
Jason,
yeah.
I'm so sorry. I just want to point out, I have an email address of rpacontact@extremereach.com. If you wish to reach out to me, rpacontact@extremereach.com.
Great.
Thanks,
yeah,
Jason.
and that's for all the attendees here. Thank you so much for the time taken to come and join us for this session. And if any of you do have questions for Mark, having lived and breathed this journey, anyone who's embarking on it, feel free to reach out to him. Again, rpacontact@extremereach.com. So thank you once again, Mark. Thank you, everybody else. I look forward to seeing those who